Welcome back, AP. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your flipped classroom and our continuing discussion of the expanding age of Metternich, right? We are now talking, or in the thick of talking about, the age of Metternich, right? And the age of Metternich being that 30-year-long time period where we kinda, sorta didn't have any war in Europe, right? I really emphasize kinda, sorta, because there was a lot of internal strife, right? A lot of internal struggles going on in Europe where we've got literally like revolts being crushed, right? We have classical liberals trying to get constitutions. We got socialists trying to get more bread and better working conditions. And conservatives like Metternich are just entering in and going, no, 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 no. Well, so like, now, big thing about it, though, when we're talking about it, we left off in class discussing the Greek War for Independence, right? And talking about how that's going to be one of the earliest movements of resistance against these conservatives, right? Now, again, I say again, let me harp on this a little bit harder. This is not my favorite stuff to teach, but it can get confusing, but I do know it well, right? I know it well, even though it's not my favorite, but the big thing about it, though, is there's a lot of stuff I know, ancillary material, little extra stuff on the backside that if you want a little bit of extra meat on the bone, story-wise, we can totally talk about those things. Just come on in and see me in the morning or at S period, and we'll get it all figured out, right? So the thing about it, though, is we left off in class discussing the Greek War for Independence, right? When little Greece, right, like Greece, of course, not little, that little of a thing, but they are one of the oldest societies in all of European history. But for decades, okay, over a century, they've been controlled by this group known as the Ottoman Empire, right? Now, the Ottoman Empire is a conservative empire that's not European, okay? They're actually what you would consider probably Western Asian, all right? Now, the Ottoman Turks, okay, now aka known as the country of Turkey, right, is going to be a very large conservative empire that emanates out of Turkey and controls the entirety of the Balkans, right? The Balkans including places like modern-day Serbia, Bosnia, Croatia, Albania, Montenegro, Kosovo, Macedonia, Bulgaria, Romania, and then also Greece, right? Now, Greece, though, is very nationalistic during this era, as they probably all also always have been, and they still are in the modern era, right? When you think about Greece, you think of a rich history. You think of the philosophers of ancient Greece, right? You think of Athens and Sparta, Socrates, Aristotle, Plato, Pericles, Alexander the Great, right? You discuss all of these larger figures in a very deep history that includes mythology, art, and culture, right? The thing about it, though, is that the Greeks are going to find it high time during the 1800s, right, the 1830s specifically, 1820s and 1830s, to try and revolt in a series of large-scale revolts against the Ottomans to establish a country all their own, right? And they're going to be driven by that concept of nationalism, okay? So nationalism is pride in your people or believing that your people have, like, an innate genius, right? Like, so, for example, there's a lot of nationalistic feelings in the United States of America, right? That there are things that we do that other people don't do that we think that are awesome, just like every other country has nationalism, right? Well, what's going on, though, is that you have to understand is that nationalism is kind of like conservative kryptonite, right? It is literally the thing that will crush them because the conservative powers of Austria, Prussia, Russia, Great Britain, and then the other leading powers in places like France and Spain as well also control people that aren't them, right? For example, Austria and the Ottomans are the best example of this, right? The Austrians, okay, very small country in the modern era on a map, back in the day during the 1800s, controlled places like northern Italy, controlled places like modern-day Slovenia, Liechtenstein, other areas including also Croatia, Bosnia, and Serbia as well. And then the Ottomans, same thing. They were a Turkish-ran empire that also controlled places like Greece, right? So the thing about it, though, is nationalism is a virus for conservative empires because people will begin to revolt because they want countries all their own. Now, that process of actually revolting to get your own country is actually called self-determination, right? That a group of people come together and they're like, we want our own country. We don't want to be a part of yours anymore. Peace out, right? So another big thing that we need to understand, though, is that in this process, you're going to see the countries of France, Russia, and Britain ally with the Greeks to help liberate them by the year of 1834. And in 1834, Greece becomes an independent country. Now, some of you are like, but wait a minute, why? All right, so, like, I thought you just said 2 seconds ago, Mr. Terry, that some of those other countries, especially Russia and Great Britain, were ran by conservative parties at the time. Why would they ally with the Greeks if that's more of a classical liberal kind of a thing to be national? nationalistic and want your own country? Well, that's a great question. It has to do with two things. One, it has to do with the fact that popular support of the Greeks began to rise up, okay? A lot of classical liberals and even romantic artists actually began to support the Greek cause, so much so that some of them even went off there to actually help them liberate themselves. That right there is, of course, the famous Lord Byron, the playwright that created the Byronic hero, writer of Don Juan, the man who apparently could woo any woman on the planet, died in Greece, actually, from an infection that he suffered when he got there to try and help them liberate themselves. This right here also is by Eugene Delacroix. It's one of his most famous paintings. It's called The Massacre at Chios, and it shows an Ottoman Turkish army murdering and massacring Greek citizens, including women, and like feeding women, mothers, children, and destroying the entirety of their nationalistic pursuits, right? So as you can see, popular support began to rise up for the Greeks, and they began to demand intervention by their governments, right? The other big thing that's going to happen, though, as well, is that France, Russia, and Britain saw a chance to kind of just go at an enemy, right? So you have to understand the Ottomans were a very large conservative power, and turns out other conservatives don't like other conservatives that actually might give them a little bit of hubbub when it comes to economic gain and stuff like that. And the Russians have disliked the Ottomans for a really long time, okay? Now, ironically enough, a little bit later on, some people are going to ally with the Ottomans in this thing called the Crimean War, but we'll talk about that a little bit later on. So you just got to remember, recruiting other conservatives is a big thing to try and crush one of your common enemies, right? Now, another big event that's going to happen that demonstrates early resistance to conservative rule during the age of Metternich is this thing called the Decembrist Revolt. And we'll actually move through this one pretty quick because it kind of flows very, very well, like a nice little story. Now, this goes down in Russia, okay? And a lot of it has to do with Russian lines of secession, okay? So what ended up happening is the rulership of Russia passed from one man named Tsar Alexander I, who is a very conservative monarch. He dies, and it passes over to his brother, Nicholas I, the father of Nicholas II, the famous Romanov czar that was the last czar of all the Romanovs, right? And he is going to, of course, end up becoming, well, no, not the father of his, not the father. Nicholas I is not the father of Alexander. Alexander III is the father of Nicholas I. Sorry, the great grand uncle of Nicholas II, right? So going into it though, Alexander I dies, goes to his brother Nicholas I, who's also a very conservative monarch as well, who wants to keep Russian feudalism, uses secret police to kind of destroy any uprising revolt whatsoever. And it skipped over this middle brother. There was a middle brother that actually was supposed to get the throne, and his name was Constantine. And Constantine was classically educated and very much pretty liberal, right? And so a lot of Russians wanted Constantine instead of Nicholas. But what the Russians didn't know is that behind closed doors, Constantine had removed himself from the line of secession, right? Constantine had thrown his hands up. He's like, yo, I don't want to be Tsar. I don't want to be the Russian king anymore. I don't want the job. Give it to Nicholas, right? But unbeknownst to them, Russian officers in the military who had liberal prerogatives, who wanted a constitution, who wanted a legislative body, who wanted more fair voting rights, who wanted to expand the ideas of liberalism in Russia, decided to actually swear allegiance to Constantine and stage a very large-scale revolt. And when they did this, it was in the month of December, so they're referred to as the Decembrists, right? So now these Russian officers, or Decembrists, swore allegiance and attempted to overthrow the government in a very, very aggressive military coup. Just like Napoleon did in 1799 with his coup d'etat, they tried to do the same thing. But what Nicholas is going to do is he's going to use his army to roll in there, crush the revolt, shoot all of them, right? Hang the 5 leaders, and anybody who survives, he decides to exile them to Siberia, right? Now that right there is a very conservative response to these things, a very a la Machiavellian response, a very a la Louis XIV response to rising classical liberal modalities and ideas within Europe is, you know what you can do? Just shoot them, right? Like so, and then Nicholas I, of course, rolls in there, does just that, exiles a bunch of them to Siberia, and then decides to reinforce conservative policies that had began to fade away. He uses his secret police to try and snuff out liberals early on and begins to try and impress his conservative ideals harder and harder on the people. Now, but luckily enough for the Russians, a guy later on named Alexander II is going to pop up, and he's going to be a liberal Russian monarch. And I like Alexander II. My man tried to get rid of feudalism in Russia. He did his best, right? And in conjunction with some other guys like Sergei Witta, they're going to try and actually liberalize Russia a little bit, right? But we'll talk about that a little bit later on and how it gets some of them killed. Now, going into it, though, you have to understand that this early resistance to conservatives as well is going to keep rolling forward, right? There are going to be other groups of people that try to resist the conservative reign of other individuals and try to get some new liberal ideas running around in their countries, right? So another big one, though, is actually going to go down in Great Britain. This one's often glossed over and not brought up in a lot of the College Board standards, but I think this is one of the best examples of resistance to those conservative powers. We're talking, of course, about the massacre of Peterloo, or St. Peter's protest, and the Corn Laws of 1819. So we're jumping back over the English Channel and heading to Great Britain, right? Now, in Great Britain, you had English liberals and socialists who were dramatically calling for reform, right? Now, in 1819, what we're seeing is kind of like some peaking out of the Industrial Revolution, right? We are beginning to witness mass, large-scale urbanization in the cities, right? We're seeing the end of the first wave of industrialism, and you're beginning to see the steam engine revolutionize the concepts of production, and factories are popping up all over English cities, right? The populations of Manchester are growing wildly quickly, and a lot of these other areas are beginning to surge in population, and they're beginning to create some demands, right? Some of these middle-class liberals and the working-class socialists want reforms. A lot of them want different things, right? They want, for example, more voting. Only about 8% of all people in Great Britain could vote at the time in 1819 when this movement is going to go down, right? A lot of them want to expand that voting, right? They want to get more people involved in the representative value of the British government, right? They also, speaking of, want better representation. So there's this thing you have to understand. Not only could most men not vote because they didn't have property rights or enough money, there was literally a property limit in Great Britain for how much you had to own to be able to vote, right? Now, on top of all that, the way the districts were drawn in Parliament as well is very equatable to what the modern-day American might call gerrymandering, right? Now, you'll learn a lot about that in American history next year and as well when you actually have civics or government with Mr. Giardina or Mr. Wooderson, right? Gerrymandering in the United States is a really, really weird thing where people draw districts to suit their needs, right? So, for example, let's say I'm a rich guy that's running for a government office in, like, New Orleans. My district, I would draw it around, like, Lakeview and then maybe Uptown and maybe Mid-City because those are wealthier areas of the city, and I think that they're going to vote me in, right? That's not fair, though, because it's actually picking and choosing who you want to vote for you. Well, they had a similar problem in Great Britain. There were these things called rotten boroughs, right? Rotten boroughs were basically these areas that sent a member of parliament to the House of Commons that is going to be voting on things and passing laws. And a lot of these people were what's known as Tories, right? Tories were very, very conservative politicians in Great Britain. These rotten boroughs, though, these districts, barely had anybody in them. The population of them was crazy low, so you basically had the same family just getting it over and over and over again. Like if I want it, my son will end up becoming the member of parliament from this rotten borough because there's not that many people voting in that area and I can just bribe people to just like vote for me, right? So they want to get rid of those, right? The liberals and socialists are like, we need to redraw the districts to make them more fairly representative so members of parliament can actually pass laws for people like us, right? There's another thing that was really, really a big problem though in Great Britain as well, this thing called the Corn Laws, right? Now the Corn Laws were actually brought in during Napoleonic France, right? So when Napoleon was wreaking havoc throughout the entirety of the continent, taking over most of the continent of Europe, what got shoved through Parliament was these things known as the Corn Laws, right? And the Corn Laws stated that you are never to buy foreign grains from the continent ever, right? Unless it's a time of an emergency, right? Unless the prices do dictate so that you must do those things. So the Corn Laws basically forced British people to buy grains. By the way, corn means any grain, right? It means barley, wheat, whatever in Great Britain at this time. So you basically had to buy corn or grains from aristocrats in Great Britain who owned large farms and were making crap loads of money off this, right? And they could set the price wherever they want because they were creating a monopoly on grains, right? So as you see, that's not fair as well. You're also going to later on see this thing called the Anti-Corn Law League pop up, where a lot of liberals begin to protest that as well. Jot that down as well, Anti-Corn Law League, right? The other thing that they want, though, as well, is some price controls. They want to make like the government to intervene and make sure that they're setting limits on prices of bread and other necessities, right? Well, to protest all of these things, right, to actually protest asking for all of these things, English liberals and socialists began to assemble at this place called St. Peter's Field in Manchester, right? Manchester, by the way, Manchester is like right in the northern area of London, all right? Very industrial town. And there's this big area called St. Peter's Field inside of a very large Park. 60,000 people showed up to protest for these things. They demanded those voting rights. They demanded the destruction of rotten boroughs. They demanded the corn laws be repealed. And they demanded price controls on bread and also some better labor things as well. And then, it became what is known as a very large-scale protest. 60,000 people showed up, right? And to try and dispel it, the Tory government sent in a cavalry unit to try and break up the entire protest, right? The cavalry, apparently, according to legend, was also very inebriated and come from pubs and stuff like that, mounted on their horses and rode into the fields, killing a large number of people, right? Several people were killed at the Peterloo Massacre. Let's look that up really quick. Peterloo Massacre death toll. It's also known as the Peterloo Massacre, okay? So also, by the way, let's look at that name real quick. Why did they call it the Peterloo Massacre instead of the Petersfield Massacre? It's an allusion to Waterloo, whenever Napoleon's forces were destroyed by the Duke of Wellington and the conservative British government there as well, right? So the thing about it is they're basically making fun of it, saying, oh, we were like Napoleon and destroyed at Waterloo. We'll call this Peterloo, right? Now, the drunk cavalry apparently killed 18 people that were at a peaceful protest, right? The first person that died in that peaceful protest was actually a baby, right? So literally a mother was holding her child at the protest, and the horse knocked the baby out of her hands, and it was trampled underneath the hoofbeats of some of those cavalry members, right? Now, public outrage will explode after this. So what the Tory government's going to try to do originally is actually suppress some rights and stuff like that. They passed these things called the Six Acts at one point that actually said you can't publicly assemble anymore. But public outrage to things like that, and then also events like Peterloo, will bubble over and lead to the passing of the Great Reform Act of 1832. Now, what did this act do exactly after this chaotic demonstration of public support for classical liberals and then also for socialists of the like? They first and foremost is going to redraw districts, right? It got rid of rotten boroughs. It redrew the districts dramatically to be more representative of population and to get rid of these basically aristocratic passing down of members of parliament positions, right? They also are going to increase the volume of people that could vote, okay? They're going to increase it to about 11% of people, right? Increasing it to about 200,000. Now, some of y'all are like, that's not that much, Mr. Terry. This doesn't feel like a great reform act. I agree, but this gets the ball rolling, and by basically late 1800, by the 1890s, 99% of men are going to be allowed to vote in Great Britain, right? So it at least got the ball rolling. Now, also, it did another crazy thing. It barred women explicitly from voting. So I know what y'all are thinking is this doesn't seem that liberal. Well, remember, y'all, no matter how liberal or socialist one might be, a lot of them were like, yes, we think all men should be able to vote. And women of these classical liberal families and socialist families were like, hey, what about us? And they were like, no, not them though. And then just were refusing to allow them to vote. Now, another interesting thing though is that this is considered kind of the beginning of what you would actually refer to as Victorian era England, right? Because Queen Victoria was actually alive for all these different things in the Reform Act, and she's going to be coming in at the later end of this unit, and we'll talk about Victorian era England and how they're going to dramatically redo some stuff, get some sewage systems going, get the duty out of the streets, start trying to go a little bit more utilitarian. And this is also really big as well because, as you notice, they're passing massive reform acts in the 1830s, right? Because look, 1832, the Great Reform Act happens, and then the Mines Act happens in 1842. The Factories Act is in 1833. The 10-Hour Act is in 1844, I believe, right? So the thing about it, though, is that you have a very large-scale reform movement that's going to go down in Great Britain, right? And a lot of people actually point to Peterloo as being the thing that tipped the scales into actually getting some things for the liberals and the socialists done, right? Now, other early resistance to conservatives as well is one big moment known as the Three Glorious Days, right? And we need to keep this one heavily in mind, especially for all of you that are going to be going to Paris and stuff like that this summer. You'll actually see a monument that's erected to the Three Glorious Days movement, okay? So another big one was we're going to jump back over the English Channel and hop back over to Paris real quick, right? We're going to jump back over to Paris and go to France and talk about how some conservatives are going to try and do some crazy stuff, and the French people are going to wag that finger and say, no, 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 not here, right? Now, Charles X is going to be the king at the time, okay? Some of you are like, well, Mr. Terry, I thought the Bourbons were coming back into power after the Congress of Vienna. They did. He is a Bourbon. He's actually one of Louis XVI's brothers, all right? So Louis XVI had several brothers that actually went into exile and ran away during the French Revolution, one of them famously known as Artois. Now, the thing about it, though, is Charles X comes into power after the death of his brother, who was actually known as Louis XVIII, right? He actually died from gangrene in his leg. All right, so like now, wet and dry gangrene. But anyway, so Charles X, though, when he comes into power, is super conservative. He wants to go back to like old absolutist France. He kind of thinks of himself a little bit like Louis XIV, the Sun King, and he wants to try and impress some conservative values onto the French people. Now, he tries to bring back that old absolutist France by doing several different things, right? Including he wants to abolish the freedom of the press, right, and heavily censor the press, which is going in direct contest to things like the Constitution of the United States of America, the Revolution in America, and other freedoms that other areas in Europe enjoy, where they're allowed to print whatever they want freely, right? Also, in the Declaration of the Rights of Man, it discusses the freedom of the press. I mean, look at Jean-Paul Marat, right? Jean-Paul Marat made his earnings and living off being a person who has had the freedom of the press with his newspaper known as La Émeu des Peuple. So, like, also, he wants to take away voting rights and actually limit the number of people who are allowed to vote in France, which is going to make a lot of people very angry. He also wants the death penalty to be enacted if you've ever stolen church objects before, right? Alluding back to, of course, to the old school days whenever the civil constitution of the clergy went down, okay? He also wants to rid France of habeas corpus, which is the right to a fair trial. He also wants to try and give lands and titles back to the old nobles who were known as émigrés, right? So, like, that had actually ran away during the French Revolution that Napoleon began to kind of welcome back into France to try and bring their money back in. He wants to basically reinstate them as nobles all over again and just take France back 18 steps, right? Now, when this happens, people just say, okay, Charles, no way, and they began to circulate these illegal pamphlets that he actually would have hated so much. This right here is one of the most famous drawings from one of those illegal pamphlets, and it actually shows Charles IX, the nutcracker, or Charles X, the nutcracker, trying to crack the charter of 1832, right? Actually trying to find like this walnut that has the Constitution written on it, and he can't just quite crack it and stuff like that, and they're making fun of him. Now, what also these pamphlets are going to do, though, is they're going to predict a new French Revolution. And what's going to happen is, just like in the French Revolution of 1789, the big one, riots are going to begin to break out in France, and in 3 days, all right, that the riots went from being controllable to uncontrollable. Charles fled in fear, right? Like, he fled in fear because on the days of July 27th, 28th, and 29th, the riots couldn't be stopped, right? And these riots begin to serve as a really interesting little blueprint for something that goes down about 18 years later, because a lot of it has to do with how the riots were done. On the very first day, in July 27th, what ended up happening is Charles sent the military out into the streets of France to try and suppress any of these rioters that were popping up. And showing a massive amount of support, people in the apartments that lined the narrow streets of France began to rain down debris on top of the actual military that was moving around to try and suppress some of these riots and bread riots that were actually going down in Paris. Now that they were throwing like desks of like chairs and tables and chests of drawers at the military down in the streets below, there's now a bunch of garbage down there, right? Now that there's a bunch of garbage, the French people began to build barricades, right? They began to start like ripping up cobblestones and stacking them up and flipping over wagons and taking a lot of that stuff the people in the apartments actually thrown onto the military and stacking up big barricades out of them, right? And what's going to happen, though, is the military is going to be sent in to engage them, and what the people realize is that they can't get past the barricades, right? And so it's going to serve as a very effective form of a revolution. Now, when he abdicates, his son actually comes in as Louis XIX. But interesting little fact about Louis XIX, he's never going to be on an AP Euro test, because guess how long he was king for? 20 minutes. So yeah, this right here is a little fact that I'm going to put at the end of your quiz for extra credit, okay? How long was Louis XIX actually in, like, in power for, right? Very little about little the guy at the bottom, though, 20 minutes of time, right? Now, the liberals, though, brought in the guy that they thought was going to be their superhero, right? This guy named Louis-Philippe, Duc d'Orléans, known as Louis-Philippe I, and he is technically the very last king that France will ever have, right? They bring this guy in thinking he is going to be the citizen king, that he is going to advocate for the liberals and the socialists and bring about great reform in France. Interesting fact of the matter as well, he was heavily supported by a very famous figure. The Marquis de Lafayette was still alive when this went down. Very old and crusty Marquis de Lafayette, but he was still very much alive. And on July 29th in 1830, after Charles abdicated and ran away, and by July 30th, when they bring in Louis-Philippe I, right, and try to coronate him as king, the Marquis de Lafayette is waiting there for him and wraps a tricolor flag around the shoulders of Louis Philippe and ushers him in as the guy that everyone believes will save the people of France, right? Now, he undid a lot of the laws against the people. However, he wasn't as liberal as a lot of people had actually hoped. So this image of wrapping him in that tricolor, Marquis, it ain't going to go as well as you hoped, okay? Because you're going to be dead by the time that whole thing really blows up in everybody's face and the revolutions of 1848 go down, okay? But that right there might be one of the better flips I've ever actually made when it comes to information and flow. So I really hope y'all enjoyed it, but I'll see y'all soon. Y'all have a good one. We'll talk more about that stuff when we see you in class.